Larry Griffin was born in Waterford in 1880, the youngest of 6 children. In 1899, he enlisted in the Royal Artillery Regiment of the British Army. He served in India for 6 years, and then later fought in France during the First World War. He was discharged from the army following an injury that permanently limited his use of one of his arms. Upon his return to Ireland, he began his career as a postman. He originally secured a position in the British Post Office, due in part to his status as a disabled veteran of the British Armed Forces, but he continued on delivering the mail, following Ireland's independence and the establishment of its own post office. Larry married his wife Mary in 1907, and the couple had a total of 5 children. By 1929, however, only 3 of the children were still alive. The family lived in the town of Kilmacthomas. Every day, Larry would collect the mail at the post office there, and then ride his bike 8 miles to the small village of Stradbally to deliver it. On Christmas Day of 1929, Larry went to morning mass and delivered gifts to his neighbors for their young daughters before setting off on his rounds. His son Jack and his daughter Alice had plans to go to a Christmas dance that night, and Larry told them to wait for him to arrive home before leaving for it, as he might have a few extra coins to give them. It was tradition at the time to give the postman some sort of token of appreciation on Christmas Day as he made his rounds, whether it be coins, food, or drink. Larry Griffin appears to have at least received the latter 2 of these on this Christmas. He had meals with 2 different families in Stradbally. A local farmer, John Cunningham, had planned to offer Larry a drink that day, but when the postman arrived at his door after 5 p.m., he had clearly been given plenty of alcohol already that day, and John decided against giving him any more. Larry was expected to arrive back at his home in Kilmacthomas between 8 and 9 o'clock. On that night, however, 9 o'clock came and went without him arriving home. It had begun to snow around 7 o'clock that evening, and Mary Griffin knew her husband would probably have been offered alcohol all day, so at first she hoped that he had decided to spend the night in Stradbally so that he could make a safer trip home in the morning. Larry was very well liked in Stradbally and had plenty of friends who would have been willing to let him stay with them for the night. Mary was not the only person waiting for Larry that night. Mr. Brown, the postmaster in Kilmacthomas, had been expecting Larry to report back after finishing work for the day. When he did not arrive, Mr. Brown went to the Griffin home just after midnight, looking for him. When Mary informed him that Larry had never arrived home, Mr. Brown tried to assure her that Larry was fine. This did not diminish Mary's concerns, however, and she waited up all night, hoping that her husband would come home. Mary Griffin's concerns were validated early in the morning of December 26th. At approximately 7:20 that morning, a man named David Connors was taking a walk on the road that connected Stradbally and Kilmacthomas. Some 2 miles out of Stradbally, he discovered a bicycle. The bicycle had seemingly been placed carefully in the road, facing in the direction of Kilmacthomas. David realized that the bike was a postman's bike because of the carrier on its handlebars that was used to hold a mailbag. The bicycle was the one used by Larry Griffin. David notified the Gardaí stationed in Stradbally of his discovery. The Gardaí initially assumed that Larry must have stumbled off while heavily intoxicated. However, by the time the afternoon came and Larry still had not been found, they began to fear that even if Larry had simply wandered off, some harm must have come to him after he did. Other postmen and friends of Larry began to search the area for him. It was another postman who first noticed that the scene where Larry's bicycle was found may have been staged. Several items, including a cycling cape, were folded up and tied onto the carrier that held the mailbag. Postmen did not typically tie their capes to their carriers like this because they had a tendency of flying up when the bicycle was in motion, when they were in such a position. Eventually, a witness who had passed the location where the bicycle was found earlier that morning came forward. At 4 a.m. on December 26th, the bicycle had not been there. After the initial, smaller-scale searches failed to find Larry, additional resources were brought in. Gardaí were brought in from other stations in the area, and a local priest implored the farmers in his congregation to search their land. Bogs were searched, and small bodies of water were dragged. Hundreds of civilian volunteers joined the search parties organized by the Gardaí despite the strong rains that fell in the days following Larry's disappearance. Within a few days, nearly a 6-mile radius extending from where Larry's bicycle was found had been searched. Despite the extensive effort, Larry remained missing. Chief Superintendent Harry O'Mara, out of the Garda station in Waterford, had become involved in the investigation on December 27th. On January 6, 1930, he received a tip from a local priest that he needed to speak with a 16-year-old named John Power. The following day, O'Mara interviewed John at the Stradbally Garda station. John Power told Chief Superintendent O'Mara that he had been in Stradbally Square, at an intersection known locally as Whelan's Corner, due to the fact that it was the location of Whelan's pub at 6 p.m. on Christmas Day with 3 other men. Around 6:30, Larry Griffin walked past him, but he was not alone. Larry was talking with Garda Edward DeLay, who was pushing Larry's bicycle for him. John believed that Larry was heavily intoxicated because he was leaning against Garda DeLay's shoulder and appeared to stop to try to vomit just before he turned a corner. The 3 men who had been with John at the time were also brought in for interviews and confirmed John Power's story. Garda DeLay had previously reported that a witness had seen Larry Griffin on the road to Kilmacthomas, a mile outside of town, which would imply that he had started his journey home, although other evidence suggested that he had not made it out of town. Garda DeLay was also adamant that the postman had been sober that night. He maintained that the postman was not drunk when Chief Superintendent O'Mara questioned him again after his interview with John Power. He did, however, acknowledge that he had seen Larry Griffin around 6:30 p.m. Christmas Day outside of the post office. He claimed that he had not previously reported this interaction because he did not believe that it was important, even though it would have made him one of the last people to see Larry before he went missing. There were also other problems with Garda DeLay's account. He claimed that he and a very sober Larry Griffin walked and talked up to the first turn on the Kilmacthomas Road, past the corner where the eyewitnesses had been standing. In contradiction to the eyewitness statements, he said that Larry had been pushing his bicycle himself. He also said that after walking with Larry up to his next turn on the road to Kilmacthomas, he turned around and passed the 4 men at Whelan's Corner. He waited for about 5 minutes for Sissy Whelan, whom he was courting, to come out from her family's pub so that they could take a walk down to Stradbally Cove. However, the 4 men had been at Whelan's Corner for another hour after seeing Larry and Garda DeLay, and none of them had seen him come back. Chief Superintendent O'Mara was losing confidence in the integrity of the members of the local Garda station, as irregularities between their statements and in their official records began piling up. His concerns grew even more when rumors surfaced that another Garda from Stradbally, Garda William Murphy, had visited Larry O'Brien, one of the men who had been with John Power in Stradbally Square on Christmas Day, and told him to keep quiet about what he had seen. Garda Murphy's records of his movements on the night of Christmas had him on patrol from 5 to 8:30 p.m. He claimed to have seen 2 specific individuals during this time, but both of those individuals said that this was false. Garda Murphy also said that he went immediately back to the barracks after his patrol, but the orderly at the barracks reported that he did not return until 10:30, and that he was in the company of Garda DeLay when he did. Gardy Murphy and DeLay appeared to be hiding something, but their behavior did not necessarily indicate that they had done anything criminal. Both men frequented Whelan's pub, in part because they liked to drink, and in part because Garda DeLay was courting Sissy Whelan and Garda Murphy was courting her sister Nora. They were a frequent source of trouble for their sergeant due to the amount of time they would spend at the pub while they were meant to be out on patrol. Their sergeant, Sergeant Cullinan, had in fact gone to Whelan's pub twice on Christmas night, not long before Larry Griffin had been seen outside of it. His first visit was to ensure that the Whelans were not serving alcohol that night, as it was illegal to sell or consume alcohol in a pub on Christmas Day or Good Friday at the time. The second visit was an effort to catch Gardy Murphy and DeLay drinking there. As best as the authorities could determine after piecing together all the shifting testimony, Larry Griffin finished his deliveries around 6 p.m. Then he and Garda DeLay had visited another guard, Garda Patrick Frawley, a short time later. Garda Frawley lived in a flat above the post office, which was next to Whelan's pub. He did not include this visit in any of his formal statements or early interviews. Larry was visibly drunk when he arrived and had more to drink during the visit. The two Gardaí eventually took the postman outside and debated what to do with him, since he would not be able to travel home in his state. Frawley walked to the pub to ask the Whelans if Larry could sleep there for the night, but Sergeant Cullinan saw him entering the pub from across the street and followed him in, thinking he would be catching some of his guards illegally drinking. Frawley, realizing he was being followed, therefore walked back out of the pub. He then warned DeLay that the sergeant was nearby, on his way back to his home. Garda DeLay then walked Larry past John Power and his three friends. Later witness statements would show that after the two men turned the corner and disappeared from John Power's view, they had gone through the back gate behind Whelans, meaning they most likely entered the pub through its back door. Whelan's pub clearly played some role in the story of what became of Larry Griffin, but how large that part was remained unclear. The pub was operated by Patrick Whelan and his wife Bridget. The establishment was not doing well in 1929. Patrick owed money to his landlord and had been sued for not paying his suppliers. Patrick claimed to the Gardaí that he had not seen Larry on Christmas Day at all, and that Larry certainly had not been in the pub that evening. However, when three men from Kilmacthomas had come to Stradbally looking for Larry on December 26th, before the official investigation started, Patrick had told them that he had seen Larry and tried to convince him to sleep off his intoxication at his home, but Larry had refused. Patrick also denied illegally serving alcohol on Christmas Day. According to Patrick Whelan, no one outside of his family had been in the pub that night. Two witnesses, Ed Dunphy and Jack Galvin, did come forward saying that they had been drinking at the Whelans on Christmas Day, although they sat in the kitchen and did not see who was in the main section of the pub. They also said that Sissy Whelan was there that evening, contradicting Garda DeLay's account of his movements. Sissy maintained that she had been with DeLay, but when confronted with the witnesses who saw her at the pub that night, she claimed that she and DeLay had been spending time in a shed behind the pub, and that she would periodically go back inside so that her mother would not become suspicious of what they were up to alone. Circumstances made the Whelans look suspicious, and seemed to place their pub at the center of the mystery of Larry Griffin's disappearance. However, the authorities did not get a full account of what may have happened to Stradbally's postman inside of Whelan's pub on Christmas Day for almost a month. On January 23, 1930, police brought in 25-year-old Thomas Corbett, a local laborer, to ask him some questions. When he came to the station, he was accompanied by another man, James Fitzgerald. James was a bachelor twice Thomas's age, who had taken in Thomas and his pregnant wife after their marriage. While Thomas was giving his statement, James began chatting with Chief Superintendent O'Mara. According to O'Mara, James willingly volunteered a statement, although there would later be suspicions that James was interviewed more formally and deliberately. James Fitzgerald told O'Mara that he, Thomas Corbett, and two other friends had gone to Whelan's pub on Christmas Day, where alcohol was being served in spite of the law prohibiting this. He and Thomas had seen Garda Frawley and Sergeant Cullinan walking away from the pub and felt safe to enter the pub through the back entrance around 6:30 p.m., knowing that the sergeant was headed away from the establishment. They had drinks in the kitchen and chatted with Bridget Whelan. According to James, in addition to the group in the kitchen, there was also a large number of people in the main room of the pub. At some point during the evening, an intoxicated Larry Griffin had dropped 3 coins. The local gravedigger, Ned Morrissey, picked them up and used them to buy drinks. Larry and Ned got into an argument, which turned into a scuffle. Ned put his leg out and tripped Larry. On his way down to the floor, Larry hit his head on a stove. Larry was not moving, but Ned turned him over onto his back and told him to get up. Larry did not answer. The rest of the people in the pub quickly realized that Larry was dead. Patrick Whelan yelled at Ned Morrissey, telling him that he had ruined him by killing a man in his house, and tried to attack him. The commotion brought everyone in the building out by the bar. Ned promised Patrick that everything would be all right if they just disposed of Larry's body, thereby getting rid of any evidence that something had happened to Larry, much less at Whelan's pub. One of the other men at the pub that night was Thomas Cashin, the principal at a nearby national school. He owned the only car in the village and used it to drive Gardy, DeLay, and Murphy around on December 26th as a part of the search for Larry Griffin. According to James Fitzgerald, he had used that car on December 25th as a part of the plot to dispose of the body of Larry Griffin. Ned Morrissey, Patrick Whelan, Thomas Cashin, and another man who had been in the pub, George Cummins, placed Larry's body, which had been wrapped in a white blanket, in Thomas's vehicle. Thomas then drove off, with Ned Morrissey in his passenger seat. According to James, there was some debate about where exactly to dispose of the body, but he believed they settled on an abandoned copper mine in the area. Garda DeLay took Larry's bicycle and promised to abandon it along the road. Garda Murphy left with him and the bicycle. While James Fitzgerald was giving this detailed account of Larry Griffin's death, Thomas Corbett was providing an entirely different story about how they had spent Christmas evening. He also said that he and James had gone to Whelan's, but they had not been let inside. They then instead went to another pub, and then to a card game, where Thomas got into a fistfight. Like so many of the other statements given to the Gardaí in this case, only some parts of this version of events could be corroborated by other eyewitness testimony. The two other men James had claimed had gone to Whelan's with him denied being there. The Gardaí were convinced by James's account, however. Because he had implicated so many important members of his community, James was afraid to remain in Stradbally. The Gardaí took him home in the middle of the night to collect some of his clothing, and he was then taken to the city of Waterford, where he was held as a protected witness. Based on James's statement, the Gardaí arrested Thomas Cashin and Ned Morrissey the following morning. They were taken to court and charged with the murder of Larry Griffin, disposing of his body to prevent or obstruct a coroner's inquest, and stealing his postbag and postman's hat, which were legally the property of the Postmaster General. 2 days later, Patrick Whelan and two other men James had implicated in his statement, George Cummins and Patrick Cunningham, were also arrested. Bridget Whelan, her daughter Nora, and son Jack were then also arrested. Sissy Whelan and the Whelans' youngest son were the only two members of the family not charged in connection with the case. Gardy, DeLay, and Murphy were also arrested on February 3rd, bringing the total number of accused up to 10. On February 7th, the first preliminary hearing in the case was held at the Waterford courthouse. The prosecution's first, and most important witness, was James Fitzgerald. When asked to provide an account of his actions on Christmas Day, his testimony started out in line with the statement he had provided in Stradbally. However, it then changed dramatically. James testified that he had gone to Whelan's and gotten a drink, but it had been handed out to him, and he and his companions had never gone inside. His new account was more in line with the one Thomas Corbett had provided. He now said that they went to a different pub, and then to play cards. The prosecution was obviously shocked by James's sudden about-face. They had interviewed him just that morning, and at that time he was still standing by his original statement. He had made only one change to it, although it was a major one. He now claimed that Larry Griffin had still been breathing when he was wrapped in the blanket and taken from Whelan's pub, which would have made the case definitively one of murder. Prosecuting barrister Finley questioned James heavily about his earlier statement, but James now insisted that most of the statement was false. Having lost this important testimony, Finley requested a week-long remand and was granted one. The 10 accused men and women were ordered to remain in custody during that time. The prosecution's main goal during the remand period was to find Larry Griffin's body. Without James Fitzgerald's testimony, the body was absolutely essential for them to make a case. The abandoned copper mines in the area were being searched in hopes that James Fitzgerald's original statement could still be relied upon, and that Morrissey and Cashin had planned to dispose of him there. Working only at night, a team of Gardaí also dug up 24 recent graves in 6 area graveyards to make sure that Larry had not been buried alongside their intended occupants. Bodies of water and local farms were searched. Still, Larry's body could not be found. At the hearing on February 14th, the prosecution had to rely on witnesses whose testimony provided only circumstantial or inexact evidence against the 10 defendants. Witnesses testified about the changes some of the defendants had made in the accounts they provided about what they did on Christmas Day, and a doctor provided testimony about some alleged bloodstains that had been found on the Whelan property, but the technology available at the time meant that his examination of the evidence could definitively say very little about it. The prosecution was given another week to build their case, and then another one following that hearing on February 21st. At a hearing on March 1st, Finlay had no evidence to present, but argued that he had reason to believe that Larry Griffin's body would be located very soon, and was given one more remand. On March 7th, Finlay conceded that further inquiries into the case would be required in the absence of Larry's body, and the evidence he believed it would provide. He asked that all charges be withdrawn while those inquiries were undertaken. All 10 defendants were released from custody. No further charges have ever been filed in the case, and Larry Griffin's body has never been found. It would be easy to blame James Fitzgerald for the collapse of the prosecution's case and a lack of justice for Larry Griffin, but his later statements indicate that he may have been right not to testify to his original statement, even though it may have been an accurate account of what happened to Larry on Christmas evening. Following the dismissal of the charges against the 10 defendants, James became concerned for his safety. He claimed that he received multiple threats, and he was unable to find work as a result of his role in the case. James promised to tell the new head of the investigation, Superintendent James Hunt, everything he knew once he was safely away from Stradbally. Superintendent Hunt was able to get a job for him with a farmer in Galway, and James Fitzgerald left Stradbally on March 14, 1930. 2 days later, James met with Superintendent Hunt and spent 2 days explaining what he actually knew and how he came to know it. This account combined many details of his initial statement, the statement he made in court, and statements of other eyewitnesses. James now said that he went to Whelan's pub sometime after 7:30 p.m., but before 8 o'clock, and drank a stout in the kitchen. Around 8, he saw Larry Griffin and Garda DeLay walking through a hallway, presumably going out to the yard. Shortly thereafter, he saw them walking back in, on their way back towards the main room of the pub. James now claimed that this was the last time he saw Larry, alive or dead. Around 8:20, James went outside of the pub, where he and Thomas Corbett, Patrick Cunningham, and Jim Murphy spent time until approximately 9 o'clock, being served drinks by Sissy Whelan through the pub's hall door. Then, as Thomas Corbett had told the Gardaí, they went to another pub, and then to a card game, where Thomas got into a fight around 11 p.m. After the fight was broken up, James, Thomas, and Patrick all left the hall where the card game was being played. James and Thomas, who lived in the same house, went in one direction to get home, and Patrick Cunningham went in another. James went to bed as soon as he made it home. Patrick Cunningham, however, apparently did not go straight home. James now claimed that he had heard about Larry Griffin's accidental death from Thomas Corbett. Thomas had heard about it from Patrick, who was his employer. Patrick had stopped into Whelan's before going home, where he witnessed the argument and Larry's death, sometime around 11:30. James said that while the details about how Larry died came from Patrick Cunningham via Thomas Corbett, the details about the disposal of the body and the mines came from other sources around town in the days after Larry's disappearance. He claimed that the only detail in his original statement that he outright made up was the white blanket he originally said Larry's body had been wrapped in. It is possible that James was relaying the actual truth about what became of Larry Griffin in his original statement to Chief Superintendent O'Mara, but that truth was not his to testify to. While we have a believable account of what may have happened to Larry Griffin on Christmas evening of 1929, his case still remains unsolved, as this account has not been verified. The investigation was full of local gossip, conflicting accounts, and reasons for people to be dishonest. However, the idea of an intoxicated Larry accidentally dying on Christmas Day and his body secretly being disposed of to avoid a scandal does keep resurfacing in this case. If Larry did accidentally die in Whelan's pub, there would have been plenty of reasons to conceal it. Even if Larry's death was accidental, it would have revealed illegal activity and had serious repercussions for many of the people who witnessed it. The Whelans would have faced legal actions for illegally serving alcohol on Christmas Day, and, given their precarious financial situation at the time, would have most likely lost everything they had. The 2 members of the Gardaí would have faced suspension, reassignment, or dismissal. Thomas Cashin was in ongoing trouble with the Department of Education for his lack of an Irish language qualification and his multiple failures of the exam to acquire one. Being tied to illegal drinking on Christmas Day alone could have potentially put his job in jeopardy, and the scandal of being affiliated with a man's death would make his dismissal much more likely. While Larry was not murdered, there was also no guarantee that manslaughter charges would not be brought against the other people at the pub that night. All these factors being considered, the idea that Larry's body was secretly disposed of to avoid problems for whoever witnessed his death seems plausible, even though many of the parties rumored to be responsible for this action would have been Larry's friends and prominent members of his community. That all being said, even if we accept the idea that Larry somehow died accidentally on the last night he was seen, we still cannot be sure of the circumstances, as the story of him dying at Whelan's pub was third-hand information by the time it reached the Gardaí. There were also rumors in town that Larry had died at the Stradbally Garda barracks, and allegations that it was really the more influential Thomas Cashin, rather than lowly laborer Ned Morrissey, who had the fight with Larry that resulted in his death. Most of these questions will never be answered, and if anyone deserved to be jailed for Larry's death, they cannot be brought to justice now, as they have all since passed away. The one remaining mystery that can definitively be solved, and is, I would argue, the most important one, is what became of Larry Griffin's body. Being unable to provide her husband with a Christian burial was a source of great distress for Larry's widow, Mary. She held on to the hope that she would find his body, up until her own death in 1958. Larry is memorialized on her tombstone, with his presumed date of death on Christmas Day of 1929. Today, the task of locating Larry's body, so that he can finally be laid to rest alongside his wife, has been taken up by his grandchildren. Lawsuits for libel were filed against various newspapers that reported on the case by various individuals involved in it until well into the 1970s. Efforts to write about the case were also hindered by a lack of access to the Gardaí's official files. As such, there was relatively little published about this case, which had attracted national attention for many years. Because the case was unresolved, the files from the official Gardaí investigation were not publicly released, but they remained kept from the public long after the deaths of the direct participants in the case. In 2009, an RTE television program covered the case and questioned why these files had not been made public. In response to the public pressure, the Gardaí made many of these files available. Fachna O'Driscoll, who had worked on the RTE program, used these files to write his 2011 book on the case. The publicity generated by the release of the book, as well as the ongoing efforts of Larry Griffin's grandchildren, resulted in new efforts to solve the mystery, more than 80 years after Larry Griffin's disappearance. It was long rumored in the Stradbally area that Larry had been buried under a road that was being worked on around Christmas of 1929 in the nearby town of Ballyvoyle. Larry's grandson, Seamus Mulrennan, was able to locate a county council document that confirmed that the road was being worked on at the time of his grandfather's disappearance. In September 2012, Larry's family and Fachna O'Driscoll were able to arrange for radar and other specialized equipment to be brought in to search for Larry's remains under the road. Unfortunately, the effort did not find Larry's remains. 90 years after Larry Griffin's disappearance on Christmas Day, his case is still plagued by rumor and debate. Luckily for Larry, there is more to his legacy than the mystery he left behind. The love his wife and children had for him has inspired his grandchildren to continue to search for his remains. Hopefully, they will one day be able to finally fulfill the multi-generational wish for Larry to receive a Christian burial.